r/nosleep. Posted by you never been here before 0. There's something in the forests of Norway, and it's terrifying.
Let me just start by saying that I've never been much of an outdoorsy person. I grew up in the city in the States, so there weren't a lot of opportunities for me to bask in the wonders of nature. Even if there were, I still wouldn't budge from my couch and Nintendo just to get a glimpse of some plants and a ray of sunlight. No, I'd rather stay in time and waste my youth away in front of the television just like the other teenagers my age. On the few occasions I would venture outside, it would just be a quick walk to the local park to meet up with some of my friends to share a cigarette or two, along with a couple of beers. You know, the usual teenage behavior. Naturally, my mother grew worried. She thought that I wasn't getting the natural benefits a kid my age ought to have, but she was seldom vocal about it. She was a single mother and sole provider for me and my younger brother, as our father died some time ago, so she had to work most of the time to provide for us all. Therefore, she wasn't around very often to dictate what we were or weren't supposed to do, which suited me just fine. During the summer before my first year of high school, however, she arranged for me and my brother to visit some family in Oslo in Norway, because she thought that this was the perfect time for us to get out for a bit. My mother's sister, Aunt Lucy, had lived there with her Norwegian husband and their son for the past 2 decades or so our mother thought it would be a good opportunity for me and my brother to get, as she called it, some quality time outside with family. Like all the opportunities I had gotten before, I was quick to decline this one as well, as I had no interest in going to Scandinavia to meet a family that I barely called twice a year. However, my mother stomped her foot down against my refusal and was adamant that my brother and I went along with it. Despite my initial rejection of her idea, as well as my general lack of interest, I agreed after some amount of persuasion from my mother's side. She said that if I agreed, then she would buy me a new game console to waste my time on. My Nintendo had grown rather old and didn't work like it used to before, so I eventually accepted her terms, albeit reluctantly. My brother and I left the following week. It took us a couple of flights to get to Oslo, and when we finally arrived, my first impression of Norway was already established: fucking cold. Even in the middle of summer, it felt like an ice house there in comparison to my home city. As we waited at the airport for our relatives to arrive and pick us up, I felt like an alien standing amongst humans. The people were talking in a language that I had little prior knowledge about, and while my brother and I were standing there in our thick layered clothing and scarves, the locals were dressed rather casually and, dare I say, scantily. I guess they were more accustomed to the temperature than we were and even found it comfortable enough if they dressed in thinly as they were, whereas we were chilled to the bone. When our aunt and her family finally came to the airport, they greeted us with open arms, and I can admit that the hospitality was welcoming. I didn't stand close to my aunt and her family, not as much as I would have wanted to, and we seldom saw each other. At most, we would exchange a few letters or phone calls over the year, but we rarely, if ever, met face to face. To spend a couple of weeks with them was a huge step, but even though I was hesitant, I tried my best to welcome the change. Besides, it wasn't like I could do anything about it. Our cousin's name was Jonas. He wasn't much older than me, and since we shared a couple of hobbies such as gaming, it helped break the ice knowing that there was someone I could relate to. All of us spent the first couple of days getting to know each other better than we had before. The family lived in a privileged 2-story house on the outskirts of the city, which had been renovated only a few months prior. It was a good place to stay, and I found myself enjoying it there far more than I had initially anticipated. Our aunt and uncle were treating me and my brother as though we had known each other far longer than we really had, but since my uncle was Norwegian, he occasionally struggled with a few English terms. Nonetheless, I appreciated the efforts. Our uncle was a wildlife biologist and was often absent from his family because of his work. During our stay there, however, we would all be going with him out to the dense Norwegian forests a bit further from the city while he worked on some projects with his colleagues which involved observing some animals there. We would be staying in a cabin that the family owned but seldom used, and he promised us that we would have the time of our life there. At first, I wasn't sure about this idea. After all, I wasn't too keen on the prospect of going into the wilderness as I would rather stay at the house to play games with my cousin. However, after Jonas too insisted that we would have a great time, and after my little brother became thrilled about it as well, I knew that I had lost against their argument. We left for the cabin a couple of days later. The drive there took us a few hours, and as the view of the vast city gradually vanished into the distance, I was quick to take note of the Norwegian landscape. I had seldom seen so many trees, plants, and fauna where I came from, and I had to admit, it was rather beautiful to look at. The sound of birds singing in the distance and the wind blowing the branches of the trees brought out a sense of serenity in me that I didn't know I had needed, nor yearned for, and the majority of my discomfort vanished like dust in the wind. By the time we arrived at the cabin, it was already dark outside. To my dismay, the place wasn't as reinvented as the house back in Oslo. It was a one-story cabin with one of those dry toilets outside that you couldn't flush with water. You could basically just piss or shit in a hole, and that would be it. The cabin itself seemed old-fashioned and ancient, like it had been built several centuries earlier in a time period far less advanced than this one. Fortunately, it had electricity, but only to manage the lights, and there wasn't any signal there either, so having our phones there was essentially useless. We were practically stranded in the middle of the forest with only trees stretching for miles, and had it not been for the car, it would have taken us days to reach civilization on foot. Despite its lack of modernity, the cabin was accommodating enough. It had a kitchen, a storage room, and what seemed to be a living room. They had ordinary commodities like couches and a table, not to mention a fireplace that was used to regulate the temperature in the place. However, since the cabin only had 2 bedrooms, the 3 of us boys had to share one of them, whereas our aunt and uncle shared the other. The room we slept in was barely large enough to house 1 person, much less 3, and to make matters worse, Jonas was the only one with a bed. My brother and I had to lie in sleeping bags on the floor, and the lack of spaciousness, as well as the sound of my brother nightly sleep-talking, didn't make it easy to doze off, so I spent the majority of my evenings lying awake in my bag next to my somniloquist other brother. We spent the first days making ourselves at home in the cabin. While it took some effort on my part, I eventually came to find some sense of appreciation for the solitude, while I wouldn't call it an immense fondness per se. I would still much prefer my Nintendo and warm bed over what I visibly had at my disposal, but given the circumstances, I was in no place or shape to make demands. We ate food warmed on the stove, drank fresh water from a well close to the cabin, and spent the evenings playing cards or board games with one another before we called it a night. Our uncle would occasionally take us deeper into the forest to get a look at the animals there, and we would be lucky if we caught a glimpse of a moose or a fox. All in all, things could have been considerably worse, but the one thing I never grew accustomed to was the toilet. It reeked with a hideous stench, and going there was always an ordeal, especially in the middle of the night when it was pitch black outside. One night, after having failed to fall asleep once again because of my brother's consistent sleep-talking, I felt the need to use the damn toilet. At first, I tried to hold it, but to no lasting success. I got up from my sleeping bag and headed out of the house with a flashlight. It was deathly quiet outside, and the darkness shrouded the deep and dense forest in a way that only added to the eerie atmosphere. I wasn't used to that kind of silence, and quite frankly, it was unnerving to listen to. I felt watched in a way that I couldn't describe, and I would occasionally hear a twig being snapped or branches brushing against each other. That alone made me feel separated from the rest of the world, and the longer I stared into the dark abyss, the more it seemed like it was staring back at me. Without wasting time, I quickly went to the dry toilet and shut the door behind me. The smell was ever so revolting, but I swallowed the content of my stomach down and went ahead and did my business. When I was done, I was about to head back inside the cabin. I discovered my brother standing on the porch, looking out into the distance with this vague glimpse in his eyes. Initially thinking he was simply sleepwalking, again, I was about to nudge him back inside when I realized that he was fully awake. "What are you doing out here?" I asked him. "Do you want me to follow you to the bathroom?" "I was just listening to the music," he answered, not sounding like he was entirely there. "The music?" I asked and looked back at the forest. I didn't hear anything but the usual foresty noises that the trees produced, so naturally, I thought that he was just hearing things because he was still half asleep. However, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being watched through the tree line, and would rather not stick around to find out. My brother pointed at the forest and into the nothingness between the trees. "She's playing her tune, and she wants me to follow her." I wanted to ask him what it was he meant, but I knew that I wouldn't get any reliable answers from him, so I took him by the shoulder and led him back inside the cabin. Surprisingly, he let me do so without fighting back and simply faltered through the door like a zombie. Taking this as a sign that he had simply heard things, I was about to shut the door behind us when I heard what sounded like a violin playing in the distance of the trees. It was a beautiful tune, like something straight out of a musical. I glanced back at the darkness and I thought I saw a pair of reflective orbs looking at me, like those of a cat in the night. I wanted to follow them and figure out where they led to, but since I had to see my brother back to the room, I hesitantly shut the door and guided him in. Jonas was still sound asleep in his bed, and after putting my brother into his sleeping bag, I finally succeeded to fall asleep as well. The dream I had that night was strange and intoxicating, like having a sip of liquor and finding it to your liking so much that you drown in a barrel of it. I was standing near a pond in what appeared to be an open clearing in the middle of the forest, yet everything around me seemed distorted. The water in front of me was dark and murky, seemingly bottomless. Then, a figure emerged from the depths of the pool, and I froze as I laid my eyes on it. It was a beautiful woman in the middle of the pond, untouched by the cruelties of the world in a way that I couldn't even comprehend. Her skin looked pale and smooth like alabaster, and she had unearthly long, dark hair that was reached down to the black waters below, making it seem like her hair was one with it. Her eyes were equally black as though the night had swallowed them whole, and yet, they looked at me in a way that could make even a mother's loving gaze pale in comparison. She reached one of her arms up from the water and beckoned for me to come to her with the flick of a finger. She smiled in a way that was as seductive as it was ambiguous, and yet, I still found myself complying with her silent demands. Without any will in my body to withstand her orders, I made my way into the water to join her. The pond felt cold against my skin, but I didn't as much as fidget as I began to swim to where she was. It was all I wanted, it seemed. The closer I got, however, the more her facial features began to contort themselves into that of a monstrous creature. Her once beautiful neck developed gills that oozed with some kind of tar-like substance, her smooth skin became covered in fish-like scales, and her beautiful face, shifted into that of an inhuman creation with razor-sharp, blood-drenched teeth. She smiled at me so sinisterly that nothing could compare to it. Before I could turn back, she grabbed me by my neck and pulled me down beneath the dark waters. I kept thrashing and struggling in her grip, but her nails dug into my flesh like a pair of knives and kept me under until everything faded to complete blackness that matched the pond. I woke up with a startle, gasping for air and feeling as though I had just spent all of my energy and breath on running a marathon. My clothes were soaked thoroughly with sweat as though I had really been diving in cold water the night before, and my neck ached painfully from where I had been grabbed in the dream. Needless to say, the sensation wasn't welcoming in the slightest, and I spent a couple of minutes catching my breath there on the bedroom floor. Even though it was so early that the sun was barely up, I decided to get ready for the day. I was already awake and doubted that I would be able to fall back asleep again, so what was the point in lying about? As I got to my feet and onto the cold floor, I felt like I stepped in something wet. Looking down, I discovered a trail of wet footsteps that led from the foot of my sleeping bag and out the front door of the cabin, which had been left wide open by whoever had entered. Being the logical individual that I was, I initially assumed that I had just been sleepwalking, or maybe my brother again? Hell, maybe it had been Jonas, or our aunt, or our uncle? Either of those assumptions was plausible, but something in the back of my brain told me that none of those alternatives were correct. Besides, why would it be wet? When everyone gathered around the kitchen table for breakfast that morning, I still asked if anyone had left the front door wide open, or if they had gone to our room in the middle of the night. I knew that it was a stupid question, and just the way my aunt looked at me indicated that none of them knew what I was talking about, so I ignored the subject altogether and tried to turn to the more logical explanations for compensation. It was probably just my brother after all, and he had gone walking in and out of the house in his sleep again. Nothing more than that and nothing less. The ache in my neck, however, didn't lessen that morning, nor did the feeling that something wasn't quite right. That day, our uncle would be occupied with some colleagues in the area, so he suggested that the three of us boys went fishing in a pond that was located a little further up in the forest. The word pond was enough to send shivers down my spine, but I tried to ignore it and went along with the idea for the sake of getting my mind on something else for a change. After packing our equipment, me, my brother, and Jonas headed into the woods on our own while Aunt Lucy stayed behind to prepare food for later. Being on our own made me feel like a grown-up, and soon enough, that horrible nightmare was washed off my mind like a stain of ketchup on my shirt, though the pain on my neck served as a constant reminder of what I had dreamt of. The walk didn't take too long, maybe half an hour or so. As we went, I couldn't help but notice that my brother was acting a little bit different. He was usually chirpy and always had something to say, but he was quiet and didn't as much as utter a sound as we walked. It was unnervingly uncharacteristic of him, and being the caring albeit occasionally pushy brother that I was quick to put a question mark on it. "What's up?" I asked him as we neared our destination. "Are you okay?" He looked at me with those same empty eyes he had the night before. Then, he broke into a smile. "I'm just focusing on the music," he said, and I was reminded of what he had told me the night before. "The same music?" I asked, and stopped for a moment to listen, but didn't hear anything. "The music she plays. She's good with the violin. Who's she? The lady by the pond? The same one that visited us last night? I halted in my steps as I heard this. Visited us? What are you talking about? She left you a kiss, he innocently poked at my throat. Don't you remember? I touched my neck as he said this. While there was no mark of any kind on my skin, I could still feel the ache there as vividly as I could in that dream. I wouldn't exactly call that a kiss, and I most certainly wouldn't go as far as to say that I fully believed a woman had given it to me in my sleep. No, I don't remember it, I said. My brother only looked at me in a way that I didn't find comforting. His eyes remained hollow as the night, almost bottomless like the pond from my dreams. He didn't say a single word, but that alone was enough to send shivers down my spine. After a few seconds, he reassumed with walking, and I promptly followed behind. When we finally arrived, I noticed that the pond in front of us looked eerily similar to the one from my dream. The clearing in the forest seemed the same, the water was a little less murky, but still haunting to look at, and the feeling of isolation struck me like a slap to my face. I expected the creature from the depths to emerge and drown us all, but there was nothing there. Still, as much as I wanted us to leave, I knew that I would put brakes on Jonah's fun. After all, he seemed the most excited about going to the lake. At first, I thought it was because he wanted to fish, but when he started stripping down to his boxer shorts, I knew his intentions were to dive straight into the water instead. Isn't it cold? I asked as I tried to dissuade him from going in. Are you sure it's safe? Jonas laughed as he threw his clothes next to his bag. It's fine. There's nothing here, I promise. Come on, it'll be fun. I don't think you should go, I persisted and put my bag down on the grass. There could be something in the water? It's fresh, so I doubt it, Jonas added dismissively. If you're not gonna do it, then I'm not gonna force you, men fun, I ain't got those same reservations, and with that said, he jumped right into the water with a loud splash and disappeared beneath the murkiness until no trace of him could be seen from the surface. I wanted to go after him, but just as I was about to pull off my shoes, he re-emerged from the water with a shit-eating grin on his face. Told you it was fine, he said and began to swim further away on his back until the distance between us grew quite prominent. As I watched my cousin relax in the water, a wave of relief washed over me. Maybe I had just been overthinking things. Of course, it was just a nightmare, and everything would turn out fine. I continuously tried to put the image of the disfigured woman behind me, but as I turned to my brother and discovered that he too had stripped down to his underwear, my alertness came back like a switch had been flicked. You're not going in there, I said and grabbed him by the arm, but he shook my hand off him with ease. The lady is waiting for us, he said faintly and pointed at where Jonas was swimming in the water. There is no lady in the water, I insisted. It was just a dream. But she's waiting for us. No, she's not. I reached to grab him again, but before I could, he jumped into the water and made his way over to where Jonas was. My stomach plummeted to the bottom of my abdomen like a 10-pound brick as I watched him go, and a million thoughts rushed through my head. I didn't know why though, I mean, it was just a bad dream, and as far as I could tell, the woman wasn't anywhere to be seen. She was just that, a part of a dream, and I had nothing to worry about. I started to feel relaxed enough to take off my shoes, and then the rest of my clothes until I stood there in just my underwear. Just as I was finished undressing, I started to hear what sounded like a violin playing close by. The same beautiful tune I had heard from last night echoed through my eardrums, and I was starting to debate whether I had truly lost my mind. I listened closer and realized that it was coming from the pond, as though whoever was playing the instrument was tumbling with it from beneath the depths of the water. Then, I heard Jonas let out an ear-deafening scream from where he was, and upon snapping my attention to him, I saw her. The deformed woman from my dream stood there in the water, with her bony, scale-covered arms stretched towards Jonas in an effort to grab him. He quickly swam away and out of her reach, but just as it seemed like he was out of immediate harm's way from the creature, my brother suddenly emerged from the water right next to him and proceeded to pull him under. Despite my brother being roughly 90 pounds or so and rather skinny for his age, he managed to pull our older cousin under with seemingly little difficulty. I watched in paralyzed horror as Jonas' head fell beneath the murky water whilst his arms waved above the surface in a futile effort to regain his breath. The woman, or whatever it was, watched the spectacle in front of her with evident amusement. Even though the waters were deep, she stood completely still, like she didn't need to move in order to stay afloat. Her black eyes were aimed at the view, and then she tilted her head to look at me. I was completely frozen. Even as I watched my brother drown my cousin, I couldn't move a single muscle for the duration of it. The woman's lips parted and her razor-like teeth shone like diamonds in the sun, and she smiled a malevolent, vicious smile that not even the devil's grin could compare to. Jonah's arms stopped moving and gradually descended to the water. My brother still held his body down and didn't seem moved by this act of murder in the slightest. His face was void of any kind of remorse or emotion, and for a moment, I doubted it even was my brother. My brother couldn't as much as kill a fly without bursting into tears, so this was something entirely otherworldly. He then looked up at me, and I saw that his eyes had turned completely black like the pond he was swimming in, just like the woman's eyes. He began to make his way over to her and embraced her like she was our mother. The creature enveloped her arms around him in return, and they both turned up to look at me with those equally black eyes. Then, each of them stretched an arm towards me without letting go of one another, and they called out to me. "Kom till oss," they said in perfect unison, and I could only describe the sound of their voices as hollow and inhuman. While my Norwegian skills were questionable at best, I knew what they were saying. Come to us. At that moment, it felt like my body had gotten a mind of its own because I no longer felt like I was the one in control. Like a puppet with strings, I began to walk towards the edge of the pond with the intent of jumping in. I wanted to come with them. It was like being a child again and being called to your mother for a hug. It was all I could focus on. I didn't seem to care about the fact that my cousin had just been drowned in front of my very eyes, and the image of his body floating somewhere down in the water was erased from my mind like markings on a piece of paper. I can't describe how or why, but the second my toes made contact with cold water, I snapped out of my trance and sprinted as far away from there as I could manage. I didn't even bother to get dressed or to bring our stuff with me, I just ran as fast as I could without stopping for a moment. My bare feet ached as I stepped over rocks and branches on the path back to the cabin where I found my aunt preparing lunch on the porch. When she saw me, she instantly knew that something was wrong. I tried to tell her what had happened, but my lungs were completely empty of oxygen and my body barely possessed enough energy to stand. In fact, I fainted right there on the porch, and I don't remember much of what happened after that. However, I recalled seeing that hideous woman in the pond, I remember seeing my brother still there with her, and I remember hearing that beautiful but nightmare-inducing violin music ringing in my ears. Years have gone by, and nothing ever came out of the investigation that was launched. They never found my brother, or my cousin, or that deformed woman for that matter. No matter how many divers they sent into the pond, there was absolutely nothing there. My family tried to have me mentally evaluated since what I told them made no sense. In a way, I couldn't really blame them, but even after I was deemed perfectly sane, my answers still couldn't provide them with any clues. They simply thought I was in shock, and because they didn't find any bodies, my brother and cousin were simply reported as missing. My mom hasn't been the same since. Her once lively and energetic self died the moment she heard about what happened to my brother. I no longer see her smiling like she used to, and whenever I bring the subject up, she will shun me like a plague and lock herself inside her room, or simply pretend like she didn't hear anything at all. I don't hear much from my aunt or my uncle anymore either. I'm not going to go as far as to say that they blame me for what happened to their son, but I can tell that simply talking to me over the phone brings them immeasurable pain. I'm also saddened by the loss of two valued members of my family, but what weighs me down, even more, is the fact that I'm the only one who's aware of what really happened to them, and I can't tell anyone. I guess that's why I'm posting this here. I'm trying to get some kind of closure, but I can't seem to get any closer to putting what happened to me behind me, as much as I've tried. It doesn't really help that I still hear that grotesque melody in the back of my mind wherever I go, and I still see those pitch black, inhuman eyes in my sleep. I have nightmares about the event to this day, and when I wake up, I find that my clothes are soaked with sweat and my floorboards are covered with puddles of water. The creature is still out there, I know it. It's someplace back in Norway, killing people just like it had with my little brother and my cousin, and it still yearns for me, the one who got away. One day, I might go back there to bring an end to it. But something tells me that I won't return. I hope I do, I sincerely do, but that thing isn't, human. It has some kind of effect on people that makes them bend to its will. If I return, I doubt I'll be as lucky as I was back when I was a teenager,